Jack Taylor, a cowboy used to the harsh realities of the West, had been riding alone for days, his boots worn from miles of travel. The hot sun hung heavy in the sky, turning the desert into an oven, with nothing but dry brush and rock for miles around. His horse moved slowly, its tired hooves scraping against the rough ground. There wasn't much to look at in this part of the desert, just an endless stretch of dirt and scattered stones. But Jack had a feeling that something was wrong. As the sun reached its peak, casting a harsh light over everything, Jack noticed a movement up ahead. He squinted into the distance, trying to make sense of it. A small figure stood alone near a large rock. It was a boy, barely more than a child, standing in the middle of nowhere. Jack's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't common to see anyone out here, especially not someone so young. The boy's hands were raised, waving frantically in the air. His eyes, wide with fear, locked onto Jack as he rode closer. Jack urged his horse forward, his instincts telling him something wasn't right. When he reached the boy, he stopped, dismounting quickly to get a better look. The boy was covered in dirt, his face streaked with tears. His clothes were torn and his feet were bare, showing signs of exhaustion and pain. The desperation in his eyes made Jack's stomach tighten. Without a word, the boy ran to him, grabbing his arm with surprising strength for someone so small. "My mommy's tied to a rock under the burning sun. Please help her," the boy cried, his voice cracking from the heat and fear. Jack's heart sank. He'd seen the effects of this desert before. How quickly it could break a person, how cruel the sun could be when it didn't let up. But the boy's words, the urgency in them, made it clear that something terrible was happening. Jack looked down at the child, his own hand instinctively reaching for the boy's shoulder. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice soft, trying to calm the boy. The boy's hand trembled as he pointed toward a cluster of rocks in the distance. "Over there. They left her. The soldiers, they think she's dangerous. But she's not," he said, his voice full of sorrow. Without waiting for another word, Jack grabbed the boy by the arm and helped him onto his horse. He didn't ask who had done this or why. It didn't matter. All that mattered was getting to the woman before it was too late. The boy clung to him tightly as Jack spurred his horse into motion, riding as fast as the animal could go, kicking up dust behind them. They reached the rocky outcrop quickly, and as they approached, Jack saw her. The woman was tied to a jagged rock, her hands bound above her head, her body slumped from exhaustion. Her skin was burned, the harsh sun leaving it red and raw, her hair a tangled mess around her face. She looked as though she hadn't had water in days. Her lips were cracked, and there was a weariness in her eyes that Jack could recognize all too well. She had been left to die in this merciless desert, abandoned by those who had brought her here. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he dismounted, quickly approaching the woman. The boy jumped down and ran to her, tears streaming down his face. Jack pulled out his knife, his hand steady despite the rising tension in his chest. As he cut the rope, the woman's head jerked up, her eyes wide with fear, as though she didn't know what was happening. "Don't worry," Jack said softly, his voice full of reassurance. "You're safe now." The woman blinked, confusion and disbelief in her eyes. Slowly, she seemed to realize that she wasn't alone anymore. Her body trembled, not from the heat this time, but from the relief that washed over her. She slumped against the rock, breathing deeply, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. Jack stepped back, giving her space, but keeping an eye on her, making sure she didn't fall. The boy had run to her side, hugging her tightly. She whispered something in his ear, her voice weak but full of tenderness. As Jack knelt down beside them, he could see the pain in the woman's face. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his anger building at the thought of anyone treating another human being this way. The woman lifted her head slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The soldiers," she said, her eyes flicking to the boy. "They think we're a threat. They tied me here and left me to die." Jack clenched his jaw, trying to suppress the rage that was bubbling inside him. He had known that things could be harsh out here, but this was different. The idea of a mother being left for dead, just for existing, was something Jack couldn't understand. He wanted to do more than just help her. He wanted to make them pay, but there was no time for that now. The boy had already started tugging at Jack's sleeve, his eyes wide with fear. "They're coming back," he said urgently. "The soldiers will find us." Jack didn't need any more convincing. He could hear the sound of horses in the distance, the steady thudding of hooves growing louder. The soldiers were coming, and they weren't going to be happy when they saw their prisoner gone. "We need to go now," Jack said, lifting the woman onto his horse. She was weak, barely able to sit up, but Jack supported her as best he could. The boy climbed onto his own horse, and without another word they turned and rode off, the sounds of pursuit already in the air. The canyon ahead offered some cover. Jack spurred his horse forward, urging it to go faster. They had to reach it before the soldiers did. The boy pointed the way, his small hands pointing to the narrow pass that would give them shelter. Jack followed without hesitation, trusting the boy's instincts. They raced through the desert, the wind whipping past them, but Jack knew they couldn't outrun the soldiers forever. They needed to find safety, and fast. As they reached the mouth of the canyon, Jack slowed his horse, looking over his shoulder. The sound of hooves was still there, but now it was faint. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. Jack led the way into the narrow canyon, the sound of hooves behind them growing quieter but still present. He looked back only once, making sure the soldiers weren't too close, then pushed his horse faster into the canyon's winding path. The walls on either side grew steeper, towering over them like silent giants, offering some protection from the heat of the desert and the danger of pursuit. The boy, Tahi, was still riding close by, his small frame clinging to his horse, his eyes constantly darting over his shoulder. Jack could see the worry in the boy's face, but he couldn't afford to slow down. The woman, Ayana, clung weakly to the back of Jack's horse, her breathing shallow and labored. The sun had taken everything from her strength, her spirit, but Jack wasn't going to let it take her life. They pushed deeper into the canyon, winding around sharp rocks and small boulders. Jack could feel his horse struggling to keep up with the pace, but he urged it on. There was no other option. They had to get out of the open before the soldiers found them. After a few more tense minutes, Jack saw a small, hidden alcove in the canyon wall, partially covered by a tangle of brush and trees. It was a perfect spot to hide. He veered off the trail and guided his horse into the shelter, helping Ayana dismount. She swayed on her feet but remained upright, leaning against the rock for support. Tahi dismounted quickly, his small hands trembling. "Will they find us here?" he asked, his voice shaky. "I don't know," Jack admitted, his eyes scanning the narrow opening. "But we're safe for now." They needed to rest. The sun was brutal, and Ayana was in no condition to keep going without food or water. Jack quickly removed the canteen from his saddle, handing it to her. Ayana drank greedily, the water dribbling down her chin as she tried to catch her breath. "I've got more supplies hidden up the trail," Jack said, "but we'll have to wait for the right moment to get them." Ayana nodded weakly, her eyes closing as if she could finally rest. But Jack couldn't afford to rest too long. He knew the soldiers would be searching, and they wouldn't stop until they had found their runaway prisoner. They would be back soon, and Jack didn't want to be anywhere near them when they did. He looked over at Tahi. "You've been through a lot, kid. Are you all right?" Tahi looked up at Jack, his young face showing signs of fear but also determination. "I'm all right," he said, though his voice betrayed his nervousness. "But we have to hurry. My mommy, they'll hurt her if they find us." Jack placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I'm not going to let anything happen to her or you. We're getting out of this, I promise." The hours stretched on as they rested in the shaded alcove. Jack kept watch, every sound outside the canyon making him tense. The soldiers could be anywhere, and he didn't trust that they had passed by yet. He had to stay alert. He couldn't risk leading them right to their hiding spot. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Jack knew that if they were going to move again, now was the time. The soldiers were probably miles away by now, but they couldn't be certain. The moment they waited for had come. Jack stood up, wiping the dust from his hands. "We've got to keep moving," he said softly. Ayana's eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at him, her face pale but grateful. Tahi had already started to lead his horse, eager to move. "Where are we going?" the boy asked. "There's a place not far from here," Jack replied, "a small town. It's safe. I know people there who can help." The promise of safety gave them all a boost of energy. Jack led the way once again, but this time they moved at a slower pace, taking care not to leave any tracks behind them. The canyon walls provided enough cover, but they still had to be careful. The desert was vast, and any small sign of movement could attract unwanted attention. They traveled for what felt like hours, Jack's eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of the soldiers. It wasn't until the sun had nearly set that they finally saw a small flicker of light in the distance. Jack's heart leapt. It was the town he had promised Ayanna and Tahi. It was close enough to reach by nightfall, but they would need to keep their movements careful until they were safely inside the town. As they drew nearer, Jack felt a sense of relief wash over him. He knew the town well, and he knew that it was the kind of place where people kept to themselves. The townspeople didn't ask questions, and they certainly didn't welcome soldiers. Jack knew they'd be safe there. They entered the town under the cover of night, Jack keeping to the shadows as much as possible. The streets were empty, save for a few flickering lanterns outside some of the small buildings. Jack guided them toward the old boarding house at the edge of town, a place he knew well. The woman who ran it, Clara, was a kind soul who had seen more than her share of troubled souls come through her doors. She wouldn't turn them away. Clara greeted Jack with a smile, her eyes warm but sharp as she looked over the group. "Who have you brought me this time, Jack?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. "Some friends who need help," Jack said, his voice steady. "They've been through a lot." Clara nodded, stepping aside to let them in. "Come on in, all of you. You're safe now." Inside, the warmth of the fire and the smell of food cooking brought a sense of comfort, and Jack allowed himself a brief moment of relief. They were out of danger, at least for the moment. Ayanna and Tahi settled in by the fire, the boy leaning against his mother's side. Jack kept his distance, still standing by the door, his eyes scanning the street outside just in case. Clara brought them food, her face full of kindness, and they ate in silence, grateful for the warmth and safety. Ayanna ate slowly, but she seemed to find strength with each bite. Tahi finished his food first, then moved closer to Jack, looking up at him with wide eyes. "Thank you," Tahi whispered. Jack smiled at him, a soft, genuine smile. "You're welcome, kid. It's what anyone would do." But deep down, Jack knew that what he had done was more than just the right thing. It was something that would stay with him for the rest of his life, the knowledge that in a world that could often seem cold and cruel, a single act of kindness could change everything. And for Ayanna, Tahi, and himself, this was just the beginning of a new chapter.